Wildberries, Russia's answer to Amazon, lets you buy almost anything. Shampoo, kitchen knives, children's toys, body armor, fiber optic cable used to guide first-person view drones onto their targets. All in the same cart, all shipped from the same warehouses. And that combination turns out to be precisely the problem nobody in Russian retail law was equipped to answer when Ukrainian drones started arriving overhead. Here is the contradiction sitting at the center of this story. Ukraine describes a precision military campaign against logistics infrastructure that supplies the Russian armed forces with drone components, navigation equipment, and dual-use hardware, components including 5-inch racing frames, ESCS, and flight controllers that appear in the same catalog as kitchen appliances and children's clothing. Legal analysts quoted by Medusa assess that the mere presence of those components on a civilian marketplace falls well short of the threshold for a lawful military target under international humanitarian law. Both positions can be accurate simultaneously, and neither side has to be fabricating anything for the situation to become genuinely impossible to resolve. That is what lifts this above a warehouse fire story and into something about what modern conflict does to the boundary between a supply chain and a battlefield. Wildberries was founded in 2004 by Tatiana Kim, listed by Forbes as Russia's wealthiest woman, and by mid-2026 the platform held an estimated 45% of Russia's entire online retail market, with its nearest competitor Ozone trailing at around 32%. In October 2024, the company completed a merger with Russ Outdoor, the outdoor advertising group, forming a combined entity called Russ Group, a deal that Russian media reported received personal approval from President Putin, a detail that anchors Wildberries more firmly inside the Kremlin's economic architecture than its consumer-facing brand suggests. Tatiana Kim's ex-husband, Vladislav Bakalchuk, was a visible figure in that corporate transition, and the ownership dispute that followed added a layer of internal turbulence to a company already operating under wartime pressure. After most Western retailers withdrew following the 2022 invasion, Wildberries didn't simply survive the vacuum they left behind. It expanded into it, becoming one of the last functioning arteries of ordinary consumer life for millions of Russian households. That context matters, because what Ukraine is targeting isn't just a logistics company, it's the physical skeleton of normal life inside a wartime economy, and the campaign has been designed, at least in part, to make that absence felt by the people who rely on it most. The strikes on Penza and Udmurtia overnight on July 30th were the 8th and 9th confirmed hits on Wildberries facilities since the campaign began, a confirmation that came from Robert Brovdi, commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, whose call sign is Majeure. Brovdi did not leave the rationale open to interpretation. His earlier statement described the intent as destroying, within seconds, the illusion of a comfortable peacetime existence for the population of the aggressor state, targeting what he called the most sensitive part of the comfort zone of ordinary imperial patriots and supporters of President Putin. That is a military commander openly describing a psychological operation against civilian consumer confidence, using the vocabulary of economic warfare rather than purely kinetic targeting. And it is also precisely the kind of statement that makes the legal question harder rather than easier. Set the legal debate aside for a moment and look at what actually burned. The Wildberries logistics hub near the village of Mastanovka outside Penza Oblast absorbed around 15 drones at approximately 4 in the morning local time, and the fire that followed spread across 62,000 square meters of facility. 226 workers were evacuated before the blaze took full hold, 4 people were injured in the process, and 1 remained hospitalized afterward. The Penza complex itself covers around 90,000 square meters and functions as a key distribution point for the entire Volga Federal District, one of Russia's most populated inland regions. Over in Sarapul, the facility in the Republic of Udmurtia measured roughly 50,000 square meters. Staff were evacuated before the fire spread, and no casualties were reported there. More than 100 emergency personnel fought the Penza blaze with over 50 units of equipment and 2 dedicated fire trains, and the scale of that response tells you something about the scale of what was burning beneath them. The campaign itself opened on July 18th, 12 days before the Penza and Udmurtia strikes, with the first hits landing on facilities in Tambov Oblast and Elektrostal, a city in Moscow Oblast roughly 60 kilometers east of the capital. Tambov was the deadliest incident of the series, with regional authorities reporting 7 people lost their lives and 25 were injured in a single night. By the time the drones reached Penza and Udmurtia, the running total across the campaign stood at least 9 people dead and more than 100 injured, drawn from statements by Russian regional officials. The damaged facilities collectively represent an estimated 552,000 square meters of storage space, which multiple analysts placed at roughly 10% of Wildberries' total logistics network capacity. 10% sounds manageable until you factor in the concentration. Several of those hits landed on the company's largest and most operationally critical hubs, not on peripheral depots at the edge of the network, and some analysts reported that half of Wildberries' 10 largest distribution centers were affected within the first week alone, though that figure stems from a single open-source claim and deserves appropriate caution. And that's when the contract clause enters the story, because this is where it gets genuinely strange. On July 7th, 11 days before the first drone strikes arrived, Wildberries updated its standard seller agreement for the 98th time. The newly inserted clause 11.3.4.1 classified the consequences of drone attacks as force majeure events, explicitly releasing the marketplace from financial liability to sellers for goods destroyed in such circumstances, and the clause applied retroactively to inventory already sitting in storage. At the time of that update, nobody in the public domain knew that drone strikes on Wildberries' warehouses were coming. The Financial Times flagged the timing. The sellers who had already committed their stock to those facilities discovered what the clause meant when they watched their inventory burn on television, with no legal avenue for recovery. You could be forgiven for finding the sequence of events arresting. The economic consequences for individual sellers aren't abstract numbers. Data Insight, one of Russia's leading e-commerce analytics firms, estimated that losses at the Krasnodar and Nevenomysk facilities alone could reach between 100 and 120 billion rubles, roughly 1.3 to 1.5 billion US dollars, at July 2026 exchange rates, assuming those facilities were fully stocked at the time of the strikes. The sellers absorbing those losses are overwhelmingly small businesses, individual entrepreneurs, domestic manufacturers, people who built their livelihoods around the convenience of a centralized platform, and under the updated terms, those losses sit entirely with them. Wildberries carries none of it. That is the kind of contractual architecture that invites questions the company hasn't answered publicly. Now pull back and look at what Russia's wartime economy actually resembles from the inside, because that context changes the weight of everything above it. Following the departure of Western retailers after February 2022, Russia's domestic platforms became structurally critical in ways they never were before the invasion. Wildberries grew into a gap that no other operator could realistically fill in the short term, its revenue reaching approximately 6.1 trillion rubles by the end of 2025, its market share rendering it effectively irreplaceable to the consumers who depended on it. Striking a logistics network that commands 45% of an entire country's online retail market doesn't simply damage a warehouse. It introduces friction into a system that millions of people rely on for basic goods at a moment when alternative supply chains are already squeezed by economic sanctions and pressure from multiple directions. Russia's investigative committee, the state body that handles serious criminal and national security cases, responded to the Penza and Udmurtia strikes by opening terrorism probes, and the framing of that legal response carries its own political logic. Calling the attacks terrorism serves a domestic purpose. Calling them a legitimate military operation serves Ukraine's strategic narrative. Both framings are being pursued simultaneously in different forums, and they are fundamentally incompatible with each other. Ukraine's military rationale rests on the claim that Wildberries' warehouses were actively used to store and move sanctioned electronics, navigation components, and hardware feeding into Russian drone production, much of it sourced through supply chains originating in Shenzhen, China's principal electronics manufacturing hub, and routed through civilian marketplaces to obscure the end destination. Analysts at Defense Express, a Kyiv-based defense industry publication with close ties to the Ukrainian military, reviewed product listings on the platform and found FPV drone components, hexacopters, and goods that could plausibly qualify as dual-use military material, sitting alongside ordinary consumer products in the same catalog. President Zelensky endorsed the campaign publicly on those grounds. A secondary rationale, reported by the Financial Times, framed the strikes as retaliation for Russian attacks on terminals operated by Nova Poshta, Ukraine's largest private postal and logistics company, which has sustained more than 20 confirmed strikes on its infrastructure since 2023. So the campaign carries three distinct justifications simultaneously: a military targeting operation against hardware supply chains, a reprisal for attacks on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, and a psychological operation against Russian consumer confidence. Whether that represents a comprehensive strategic doctrine or a rationale that evolved alongside the campaign is a question the available evidence doesn't cleanly settle, and probably both answers contain some truth. But here's the thing. The legal question underneath all of this is whether any of those framings satisfies Article 52 of the 1977 Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, the provision, authoritatively interpreted by the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, as requiring that a legitimate military target make an effective contribution to military action, and that its destruction offer a definite military advantage. The presence of dual-use goods inside a warehouse that also ships kitchen appliances and children's clothing doesn't automatically clear that bar, according to the legal analyst Medusa consulted. The ICRC's own commentary on Article 52 notes that civilian objects do not lose their protected status simply because they might incidentally benefit a party to a conflict. International humanitarian law wasn't drafted with algorithmic marketplaces in mind, or with the operational reality that a single seller listing on a civilian platform might dispatch body armor to a frontline unit and a birthday present to someone's grandmother from the same logistics hub in the same consignment batch. The legal framework is being stress-tested by a situation it wasn't designed to handle. The result was a company pivoting fast. Wildberries confirmed the Penza and Udmurtia strikes publicly, announced it was rerouting shipments to unaffected facilities, and began, according to multiple reports, searching for approximately 100,000 square meters of warehouse space in Almaty, Kazakhstan, aiming to place part of its operational infrastructure beyond the reach of Ukrainian drone strikes. That is a significant logistical and financial undertaking for any company, and it's also an implicit acknowledgement that the campaign is expected to continue at pace, that no facility inside Russia currently offers reliable protection, and that the company is planning its future operations around that assumption. What nobody expected was the speed at which the campaign accumulated scale. 9 confirmed facilities across multiple Russian regions in under 2 weeks, a combined footprint of over 500,000 square meters, more than 200 workers evacuated from a single building in the early hours of the morning, at least 9 people dead across the full series of strikes, hundreds of small business owners holding destroyed inventory with no contractual route to compensation, and Russia's dominant e-commerce operator quietly scouting warehouse space across the border in Almaty. And sitting above all of it, a military commander in Kyiv who framed the whole operation as a strike against the comfort zone of ordinary Russian life, using drones to burn the warehouses that delivered their shampoo, their kitchen knives, their children's toys, and their drone guidance cables, all from the same building, all on the same platform. The line between a supply chain and a battlefield didn't shift during this campaign. The real question, the one that international legal scholars, military lawyers, and the sellers watching their stock burn are now all sitting with, is whether that line was ever as clear as everyone assumed it was. If the gap between what gets called a military target and what actually qualifies as one interests you, that is exactly the kind of territory this channel covers, and the next story in that space is already in research.